You know, we had a long discussion over many years about Labour Party membership.
Yeah, you were.
How do you win over the working classes towards socialism in or outside the Labour Party? And I thought after Galloway was elected last year, about this time, when was it, February or so he was elected, that his election might galvanise support for an alternative to the Labour Party. And that's why I stood for MP.
Why do you think he didn't?
He should have got kicked out.
You should have known George Galloway was on the way out. Because it remains the case. It remains the case that the
policies.
It remains the case that the mass of working people in Britain are not politically engaged enough to question the existing trajectory of politics. And the way they are prepared to challenge
that's not George's fault.
No, it's not his fault. No. It's not his fault, but it's a miscalculation to think that sudden shift would take place at that moment. Possibly, had Jeremy Corbyn had some balls, had he stood up and said what should have been said, had he opposed the anti-Semitism allegations against him from day one, which were utter nonsense. Had he opposed the expulsion of Ken Livingstone, had he opposed the expulsion of Mark Wadsworth and others who were accused of anti-Semitism.
Had he stood for Brexit?
Well, had he remained behind Brexit after people voted for it. I personally voted against Brexit, but once the decision was made, I agreed that it should be carried out. Simply because it was the will of to attempt to avoid that.
He did. So he converted.
He changed his position.
Well, he disappeared.
He changed his position because of John McDonnell.
So Corbyn has persuaded me to vote Remain against my natural inclination coming from the Tony Benn position. So he took an internationalist position, which I thought was interesting, but actually it was the wrong decision. He should have been true to his roots, should have been true to Tony Benn's position, and he should have stood for Brexit. And that he would have and rejected the right-wing Labour Party. It would have split the Labour Party, but he should have taken that. He was intentionally.
When the vote, but don't forget this. All the political parties except for the Brexit brigade accepted there were different views on it. So the issue was not about did you vote this way or that way. It was about do you carry through on what the public have decided to do. And on that respect, Jeremy Corbyn capitulated to the right wing in the Labour Party, and in particular, this was orchestrated by John McDonnell, his shadow cabinet, chancellor, who messed him up, and he would constantly sabotage. John McDonnell was the main man destroying Corbyn's leadership from inside. Whether he intended to or not, he was a manoeuvrer, a manipulator, and he's untrustworthy, unreliable, and he led to the collapse.
Is that true?
He led to the collapse of Jeremy Corbyn. I mean, as an insider, I was inside in the game at the time. I remember John McDonnell coming to meetings in Parliament. We would discuss about political issues. He would turn around and give a really militant talk to us in what was called
Who advised him
Labour
to go
briefing.
to Downing Street?
Meanwhile, he would then go back and have a chat with Keir Starmer. He's the guy who brought Keir Starmer in. And Keir Starmer then immediately turned around and said, I will destroy Jeremy Corbyn and I will do everything until he's completely destroyed. And then you see
Who advised
the anti-Semitism
to join the election?
You see how prophetic it would have been had Jeremy Corbyn stood up on the anti-Semitism issue, turned around and said it was a pack of lies, orchestrated by the Israel lobby, which was confirmed by the entire evidence from Al Jazeera, what's called the Labour Files, and also the Al Jazeera programme about Israeli intelligence infiltration. Israeli intelligence infiltration of the Labour Party and the Labour Friends of Israel and their brigade,
the right wing of the Labour Party,
which is in hot to Israel. Had he stood up to that, we might have had a different situation happen in Britain, and in particular on the issue of Palestine, which now has become, the seminal issue of the day. The Labour Party is actively backing Israeli genocide against the Palestinian people and the manipulation of lies in the mass media, on the television, in the radio, in the newspaper, all in support of Israel. And there were people who thought Donald Trump is different. And initially he told the Israelis, try and make a deal. Next day, Israel is bombing the people of Gaza again after the ceasefire has been agreed. And so here we have the perfect example of the barbarity of the system of capitalism that we live under today, where all the main so-called democratic countries are actively engaged in supporting the slaughter of the people of Palestine, the people of Gaza, in the name of what? In the name of October the 7th. On October the 7th, the evidence shows there were no babies put in ovens, there were no babies beheaded, and there were no women raped. Contrary to what all the mass media said, what all the government lackeys say, what all the agents of Israel say, this did not happen. Investigations were done into this. This did not happen. Not only that, but Israel killed around 200 of the people who were killed, claimed to be Israeli victims or Jewish victims of Hamas,
friendly fire,
killed by Israel. Some 200 people of those on October the 7th were killed by Israel. There's a whole mass of cars all sort of welded together by gunfire from helicopter gunships, which Hamas did not have. Yet Israel had, because Israel had something called the Hannibal Directive, which means they will not allow their people to become hostages, because otherwise they have to give up Palestinian hostages. When the hostage deals were done, suddenly you could see what was going on, because they exchanged a handful of Israeli hostages captured by the Palestinians for hundreds or thousands of Palestinians. How can there be hundreds or thousands of Palestinians in prison under the Israelis in exchange for a few Israelis captured by Hamas? In other words, they themselves have had hostages for decades, held by Israel, incarcerated, many of them children or women, without charge, without trial, for decades. And then, is it then any wonder that the people of Gaza rise up and try and break out of the concentration camp they're kept in? It's no wonder whatsoever. And then they say everyone has to condemn Hamas. It became the talking point for the entire period since October the 7th. The only thing you get asked if you go on Piers Morgan or you go on the television is, will you condemn Hamas? Will you condemn Hamas? Will you condemn the terrorist Hamas? Well, who's condemning the terrorist Israel? The only people condemning terrorist Israel are marching on the street. And who leads those people marching on the street? It would be hoped that you could run a campaign of civil disobedience that would be able to break the link between Britain and Israel. Sorry? Oh, I don't condemn Hamas. Why should I condemn Hamas? Hamas is the elected government of the people of Gaza.
Are they any more
and they're
right
fighting
wing
back
than Netanyahu?
against Israel. Fighting back in a resistance war against Israel. The United Nations
Netanyahu
legally
promotes
says
extremist
people have the right
terrorist
to fight back against illegal occupation and terrorism against them. Of course they have the right to fight back. Why should people condemn Hamas? Sorry? Well, morally, I think people know. Well, militarily, Hamas doesn't have an army. It doesn't have helicopter gunship. It doesn't have support of America. It doesn't have support of Britain. It doesn't have support of Europe. Israel does, because Israel is the agent of America, Europe, Britain and Europe in the Middle East to control the Middle East, to manipulate the Middle East, even to the point of financing, arming and training terrorists who they claim to be their enemies. For example, HTS in Syria, still described under British law as a proscribed terrorist organisation. Do the British meet with them? Yes. Do the British make deals with them? Yes. Do the British support them? Yes. Do the Americans support them? Yes. Do the Israelis support them? Yes. So who's to condemn? If the British, Americans and Israelis are all supporting HTS, a proscribed terrorist organisation, why the hell should people in Britain or people in Europe or people in America or people in the Middle East or the people of Palestine not support Hamas? Why should they not support them? If it's illegal for the British regime, the British government, the American government, the Israeli government to support HTS, which is an offspin of ISIS. Go on. Come on, Martin. If he wants to engage, go ahead. Let's see what you've got to say. Bring it on. Do you condemn terrorism by Israel? Slaughtering children by Israel. Slaughtering women by
Three former
Israel.
prime ministers of Israel.
You don't support, you don't oppose it, no?
That's right.
What a wanker you
There
are!
you go, here you have the utter hypocrisy that's engaged here. The utter mental hypocrisy.
See, in Israel, that's like
It's perfectly legitimate to stand here and say Israel can kill whoever they want.
Exactly.
But if anyone kills an Israeli or imprisons an Israeli, that's monstrous barbarism, terrorism, and must be condemned. There you have the utter hypocrisy.
Why would a country with no army attack another with an army? Why would they do that?
Why would one country?
Why would the Gazans attack a country with no army? If they don't have an army, why would they attack a country with?
You mean break out of a prison camp?
They were breaking out of
They broke out of a prison camp for exactly the same reasons. Why? In 1944, it was legitimate. In 1944, it was legitimate. Hang on.
It's the suburb of Israel.
In 1944,
the better for all of us.
in 1944, it was legitimate for Jews in Auschwitz to break out of Auschwitz. In 20, it wasn't. Not legitimate.
They were seen as heroes.
It wasn't legitimate. I said 1944, people in Auschwitz had the right to rise up against their prison
Fine,
guards.
compare it to the Warsaw Ghetto.
Or the Warsaw Ghetto. Or the Warsaw Ghetto.
The difference here is that Hamas are the Nazis.
No, I think you'll find that Israel.
Netanyahu is a Nazi.
Today are the Nazis.
You get confused, sir.
Netanyahu is a fascist.
The Israelis try and present themselves. The Israeli state attempts to present itself. Martin.
What's that got to do with anything? I'm not stopping him.
Sir, don't take this personally, but you're a thick fucker.
Yeah, okay.
The guy wants to listen to engage. So you can come in when you want, but listen, some people
And
want
an
to engage.
ugly one as well.
So the Israelis claim to be the victims of the worst slaughter in history, the Holocaust in the 1940s.
And is that not true?
I'm saying they claim to be this.
Is it not true?
Now it is certainly true.
One minute.
Have you heard of the Ergon?
And in exchange for this,
Three
they
prime
are
ministers
saying
were terrorists.
they have the right.
Begin of Erdogan.
They have the right.
All linked to the terrorist group.
70,
and they all went
80
on to be
years
prime
later,
ministers.
80
He
years
doesn't even know
later,
his history.
to slaughter the people of
He
Palestine.
served twice.
Slaughter
18
them
years.
because
Twice
they
he
were
served,
victims.
but he
And in
forgets
fact, when you go and look at the people who are fighting for the IDF, when you look at the population of Israel, you go and interview them on the streets
They're
in Tel Aviv.
brainwashed like white South Africans.
Exactly right.
Huge numbers of those fighting.
Exactly right.
They're born in Brooklyn
Apartheid.
or in the United States, or they're born in Russia. They're imported into Israel in order to occupy
More
the land
Jews in
for
New
the
York, you
Palestinians
thick fucker.
and drive the Palestinians out. So they are carrying out, the gentleman here compared them to the Nazis. They are carrying out policies very similar to the Nazis.
To the Warsaw Ghetto.
A lot of Jews, during the Holocaust, and they asked them why you want to come back. They want to come back to Hungary. They never said we're going to come back to our country, Palestine. So most of them come back to Hungary, Poland, and
That's all he is. That's all he is.
This man, for example, because they always hope Palestine never existed. This man's driver's license says where he was born. It says in the UK driver's license, born in occupied Palestinian territory.
I've never seen that before.
It doesn't say Palestine.
Occupied Palestinian territory. Occupied by who? Occupied by
Thank
who?
God Israel has got you on its side.
Yeah.
Not only this,
What an intellectual
but in the last
heavyweight
week it was
you are.
revealed that in Britain, The police are being instructed by the Israeli embassy, who they should arrest. On protest demonstrations and for publishing articles or posts on the internet. Who should be arrested? Decided by the Israeli embassy. You go on demonstrations and there are Israeli agents standing amongst the police, telling the police who to arrest. And the police are going and arresting them.
Like this guy here.
Last week in The Guardian.
You don't talk against Holland.
Yes, it was in The Guardian. And in case you didn't know, last week there was a study made, international study of press freedom. Israel came in the last 10 of all countries in the world. All countries in the world. So don't believe these lies. They've been telling for decades. Israel is free. Israel is democratic. Israel is the representative of democracy. And in fact, there is some truth in this. That just as Israel claims to be the vanguard of democracy, so Britain and America and Germany and France claim to be vanguards of democracy. And yet whenever there are wars break out around the world, you can pretty much guarantee you will find the hands covered in blood from Europe and America involved in all those wars across the Middle East. Look at Libya, look at Syria, look at Iraq, look at Iran, Iraq, look at the conflict in Kashmir. All these you can find the trace. Afghanistan, the trace of American or British power involved in the slaughters in those countries. And then they scream in Britain that there are too many foreigners coming to this country who are Muslims, occupying our country and stealing our land and our rights. At the same time, they cheer on sending people to Israel, Europeans and Americans going to Israel and stealing other people's land. Well, the Palestinians have the right to armed resistance. It's in the United Nations. You have the right. Just the same as the South Africans had the right to armed resistance, so do the Palestinians. Of course they do. That's what the definition of this man's driver's license says. Occupied Palestine. The people have the right to rise up against their occupation. It's a just war. A just war.
Oh, shut up, you pygmy!
Shut up.
You see, the Palestinians, contrary to what you imagine,
Sounds like a true Israeli.
He lost his wife to a Palestinian guy.
I am in my country.
You're not English. You're not English.
contrary to the Israelis, the Palestinians can lose, and do lose, thousands and thousands of their brethren. Thousands and thousands of brethren in prison, incarcerated, killed, exiled. The Israelis are scared when they lose a few people. That's why you get the internal disintegration that we're seeing in Israel. And of course it is important to appeal to those Israelis who've got a brain and who've got a heart and understand what's happening and understand that eventually Israel will fall, whether they like it or not.
And we look forward to
Even the
it.
security services inside Israel are now collapsing.
You will fall. You will.
So the idea
And I'll
that
be
they
the
can win
first one to
simply by
reclaim
holding out
Jaffa
and
Orange.
pretending they're standing for some religious representation from the Bible or from the Torah. This is utter and
Since
complete
when was
bullshit.
God in his
Most of the people in Israel do not really believe in Judaism. They don't believe, they just count as members or Israelis because their grandparent, one of their grandparents or their great-grandparents claims to be Jewish.
They're all
And
bloody
Jewish
Eastern
is about
European.
conversion.
Right.
It's not about ethnicity, it's about conversion. The Palestinians themselves
And all the
are
bloody
indigenous
Russian
people.
gangsters are Jewish.
They are prepared, they are happy to live just the same as Jesus was a Palestinian. And the
real Jews are
Christians live amongst
Palestinians.
them.
Jesus
That
was
they have a right to live
Palestinian.
collectively with equal rights in that land. And then the Israelis who want, or the Jews who want to remain, can remain there and live in peace and harmony with their neighbours without incarcerating them, imprisoning them and slaughtering them and their children. And they imagine, the Israelis seem to imagine, like Donald Trump says, that one day they're going to be able to push the Palestinians out. if the Palestinians are prepared to live amongst the rubble, where their mother, where their wife, where their daughter, where their son is killed, in rubble where they were killed, if they're prepared to sit it out and be moved from one corner of Gaza to the other amongst the rubble, you think they're going to move because the Israelis say move. You think they're going to give up fighting because the Israelis say stop fighting. They will never give up fighting until they win. And that is a just war as surely as the war against Hitler in the Second World War was just. These lies they tell, endless lies they tell to justify their position. And the amount of airtime these terrorists get, and the terrorist supporters get, the amount of support they get, reveals the corrupt nature of the entire system of power in the Western world. No criticism is allowed in Germany. No demonstrations in support of Palestine allowed in Germany. People arrested all over Britain for supporting the opposite, supporting the struggle against the Israeli terrorists. And you know, just anybody with a brain can see it. Look, I've never been a supporter of Greta Thunberg, but when I see what she says now, she's talking the truth. And yet when she talks the truth now, nowhere do you see her on television.
Shut up, you
she used to be on television, remember? Greta Thunberg, they meets with Klaus Schwab, meets with the UN, meets with Keir Starmer, meets with all the leaders of the world, speaks of the United Nations. Now, the only place you find her is TikTok and Twitter. That's because she now supports the Palestinian cause. She happens to have woken up to that cause. I don't agree with her in the climate, but she's recognised as well that the Palestinian cause is a higher cause than the cause of so-called climate change, which she always believed. In fact, you're correct. I would calculate, by guessing, but I would calculate 80% of the world supports the Palestinian cause. Just the same as 80% of the world supported the South African cause of liberation. I remember organising meetings for South African revolutionaries who came here and they were accused of being terrorists. They were accused of being terrorists. I remember people came down to Speaker's Corner, members of the Conservative Party, and they had T-shirts. Nelson Mandela is a terrorist. Hang Nelson Mandela. The youth of the Conservative Party used to say that. Margaret Thatcher used to say they were terrorists. And so you'll see, as the phrase they used to say, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter. The fact is, 80% of the world consider the people rising up in Palestine against the Israelis to be freedom fighters. I don't care what religion they pursue. There are Christians, there are atheists, there are Muslims amongst the people fighting. And how can it not be the case, given the fact they slaughter those people regardless of their religion or their belief? And the people, children of such a young age, who cannot really have any belief except what they're born into by their family. And therefore that struggle, like all struggles around the world in this time, for freedom, for democracy, for liberty, for human rights, and for social change to improve the lot of the mass of people of the world. All those struggles are just. All those struggles are struggles of liberation. And the Palestinian struggle is the central focal point at the moment of that struggle. Just as, in my opinion, a few years back, the struggle against the lockdowns was a decisive struggle for freedom and democracy as well. Thanks very much for your journey.